Our speaker this evening and the recipient of the Doolittle Award will be Professor Dick Betts, and I'll introduce him in a few minutes, as I said, but I just want to remind you a few things about General Doolittle's life and career. General Doolittle remains the only American to receive both the country's highest military and civilian honors, both the Medal of Honor and the Medal of Freedom. On April 18th, 1942, which is 70 years ago yesterday, then Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle and 79 other volunteers launched 16 B-25 bombers from the USS Hornet, an aircraft carrier, to attack Japan. Getting these heavily loaded twin-engine bombers off the deck of a carrier was a major feat of flying skill, certainly not a planned mission for those who designed the aircraft or those who designed the aircraft carrier. General Hap Arnold chose Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle to lead Special Mission Number 1 because General Doolittle, or then Colonel Doolittle, was known as the master of the calculated risk, applying skill and science to pull off feats that seemed reckless and daring to others. Of the 80 men who took part in the raid, 3 were killed during the mission, 5 were interned in Russia, and 8 became prisoners of war in Japan. I think 3 or 4 are still living to this day and have been interviewed on the radio lately. General Doolittle bailed out over China and made it back to the United States. He received the Medal of Honor for leading the raid and was promoted from lieutenant colonel to brigadier general, skipping the rank of colonel, and that is how you do it. And for those of you who are trying to get tenure, it's the same thing. When General Doolittle accepted his Medal of Honor after the raid, he did so reluctantly, saying he would accept it on behalf of the men who took part in the raid, and he vowed to spend the rest of his life trying to live up to that honor, which I think he did. His first career was actually as a prize fighter. He frequently fought under the name of Jimmy Pierce. He dropped out of the University of California, Berkeley, which is where I took my graduate degree. He dropped out of UC Berkeley in 1917 to join the Army Signal Corps in order to attend pilot training. And, again, a lesson to all of us. World War I ended before he could fly in Europe, but he quickly became an accomplished pilot and was known as a bit of a stunt flyer. Several of his stunts got him grounded for short periods of time, but not for very long. In September 1922, he made the first of his many historic aviation feats, flying the first ever cross-country flight from Pablo Beach, Florida to San Diego in 21 hours and 19 minutes, making only one refueling stop along the way at Kelly Field in Texas. In July 1923, after serving as a test pilot and aeronautical engineer at McCook Field, Ohio, he entered MIT, earning his master's degree in 1924. He received, in 1925, a PhD in aeronautics, the first one awarded by MIT. So 1 year between a master's and a PhD, another lesson to all of us. Of course, there was a lot to learn about aviation in those days, so theses were lying around in the street to be done. He also helped develop the artificial horizon and directional gyroscope and made the first flight completely under instruments on September 24th, 1929. He completed the first blind flight, proving it was possible to fly by the gauges. He later received the Harmon Trophy for his experiments that made all-weather airline operations practical. Between 1925 and 1932, he won the 3 big air racing trophies of the time, the Schneider, Bendix, and Thompson trophies. And then he retired from air racing, saying, "I have yet to hear anyone engaged in this work dying of old age." In 1930, Doolittle left active duty but remained a reservist and returned to active duty at the outset of the Second World War as a lieutenant colonel when he organized and led the famous raid over Tokyo. In July 1942, he was assigned to the 8th Air Force, and in September became commanding general of the 12th Air Force in North Africa. In February 1943, he assumed command of the Anglo-American Strategic Air Forces in North Africa, and he was promoted to Major General in November, and in March 43 became commanding general of those air forces. Later, he commanded the 15th Air Force in Italy, which was stood up in late 1943 to run strategic bombing missions from Foggia in southern Italy up into Central Europe. Many of you know that my uncle, David Weinstein, was a bombardier in one of those groups and flew many missions out of Foggia over Austria and Germany. And a sad note, my uncle passed away just this autumn, as many of the great airmen and soldiers and sailors and Marines of this generation are now doing, and it's good to keep a thought for the great feats that General Doolittle and his airmen were able to perform in service to this country, in defense of this country against fascism. It's not widely known, but General Doolittle and George Patton were great friends throughout their careers and through the war. In January of 44, General Doolittle took command of the 8th Air Force in England, flying heavy bombers against European targets. He was promoted to lieutenant general after taking command. So meteoric rise throughout the Second World War. He held that command until May of 1945, when he began moving part of the 8th Air Force to Asia, to the Pacific, to participate in the expected operations against Japan, which fortunately never happened. After the war, General Doolittle became a civilian. He was the first president of the Air Force Association. He devoted his energies to lobbying for an independent Air Force, and he was conspicuously successful. In March of 1951, he was appointed as special assistant to the Air Force Chief of Staff, serving as a scientific advisor on matters associated with the ballistic missile and space programs. He retired from that duty in 1959, but continued to serve as chairman of the Board of Space Technology Laboratories and devoted his time to many other civic and industry endeavors, and he died on September 27, 1993. So we're here to celebrate the memory of a great man, a great airman, a great scientist, and a great MIT alum. So enjoy your dinner, and after dinner, I will introduce our speaker. Thank you. Well, thanks for quieting down without me making a big show of it. It makes it a lot much easier. It's my privilege this evening to introduce our speaker. I'll say a few formal words about Richard Betts, and then maybe a few personal words, since someone asked me how long I've known Dick, and I spent 5 or 10 minutes trying to go back the years. And I believe it's 34. I think it's 34 years. Yeah, well, Dick looks young. I'm the one who's showing the age. So as some of you know and some of you don't, Richard Betts, whom most of us who are friends know him as Dick, is the Arnold Saltzman Professor of War and Peace Studies in the Political Science Department at Columbia. He's director of the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies, and he's also director of the International Security Policy Program in the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia. So he wears many hats, does many things, and this is a characteristic of his entire career. He was Director of National Security Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations for 4 years. He's now an adjunct senior fellow there. He was a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution until 1990, and an adjunct lecturer at the Johns Hopkins Paul Nitze School of International Affairs. At various times, he's also taught at Harvard, and he has a connection to Harvard, the school upriver, because he has all of the degrees that I know about that he has from Harvard government. He was a staff member of the original Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, the Church Committee. He was a staff member of the National Security Council. He served on the Walter Mondale presidential campaign. He has consulted for the National Intelligence Council, the Departments of State and Defense. He served for 6 years on the National Security Advisory Panel for the Director of Central Intelligence, was a member of the National Commission on Terrorism, and currently serves as a member of the External Advisory Board for the Director of the Central Intelligence Agency. And he lectures widely to all of the advanced service schools. Dick served in the Army and was discharged actually as a second lieutenant in 1971. His writings have earned 5 prizes, including the Woodrow Wilson Award of the American Political Science Association for the best book in political science. His first book, Soldier, Statesman, and Cold War Crises, was reissued in a second edition by Columbia University Press in 1991. For those of you who like inside baseball, this book was the inspiration for David Petraeus' dissertation at Princeton University. So some of these books actually cast a very long shadow. Dick is also the author of Enemies of Intelligence from Columbia University Press and American Force, also from Columbia University Press. He published 3 books while at the Brookings Institution: Surprise Attack, which he was working on when I first met him, Nuclear Balance and Nuclear Blackmail, and Military Readiness. He also edited several other Brookings books, including a book on cruise missiles, which may be the closest connection to the air power theme of this evening. But I threw caution to the wind on connecting to the air power theme tonight, and I won't try and turn gymnastics to do it. He's published lots of articles on foreign policy, military strategy, intelligence, which is a special field of his, conventional forces, nuclear weapons, the arms trade, collective security, security in Asia and Europe. It's really quite striking. He received the International Studies Association's Distinguished Scholar Award in 2005 for the Security Studies section. I always think of David Letterman, who used to call Larry King the Iron Horse of American broadcasting. I've always thought of Dick Betts as the Iron Horse of American security studies. Now, as I mentioned, I've known Dick for 34 years, and you would have think that gives me a lot of stories to tell about Dick, but actually it doesn't. It gives me more stories to tell about Dick about me, which is, of course, my favorite subject. So I can tell you one or two, which may take the bloom off this rose, but give you more insight into Dick's personality. When Dick was at the Brookings Institution, I applied as I was starting work on my own dissertation for a guest scholar position at Brookings. I needed a base in Washington from which to do my research, and I'd heard about these Brookings positions, and I applied for it. And at that time, the Security Studies program at Brookings was going through a kind of a leadership vacuum. There wasn't a senior leader, so the administrative director of the Security Studies program was looking through all the applications trying to decide who should we pick this year. So she happened to look at mine, and she was trying to decrypt it, and she handed it to Dick. And she asked him, so do you have any idea what this guy is working on? And Dick looked at it and said, nah, I have no idea what he's working on, but he sure looks smart, so let's bring him in here. So that was one of Dick's first acts of faith, one of many, as far as I'm concerned, as far as my career is concerned. During the year that I was at Brookings, he read a lot of what in retrospect is quite impenetrable first draft of dissertations and provided lots and lots of comments. He was extremely patient. And in general, my understanding of Dick's career at this time, in terms of his relationship with me, it really is manifested by his things he did for others at the time. After Vietnam War, the United States went through many different kinds of problems. The American military had its crises, but our field also had a crisis, and many people left this field. Not too many people stayed in it, and Dick Betts did stay in it, and he's gone through several iterations of security studies essentially being finished in the United States, and he's always stayed the course. And he stayed the course then, and he served really as a mentor and an inspiration to many of us, and that's really one of the reasons why I wanted to have him here tonight. And finally, I should just say that it's very hard to say no to Dick when he asks me to do something, and I think he knows this. So some years ago, he asked me and Cindy to participate in the SWAMOS, the Summer Institute on Military Operations and Strategy, that he runs through the Columbia program, but runs in the wilds of Ithaca, New York. And this is another example of the collective goods that this man creates for this community. And those of you here at MIT and the Security Studies program, you all know the kinds of things that we're trying to accomplish here, and particularly the thing that, you see our military fellows here in full battle regalia. They didn't tell me I'd have worn mine if I'd have known they were. Cindy bought me a tuxedo. That's as close as I can get, but we're able to do some things here that not every program can do, and Dick understands this, and he also has a great program at Columbia, but everyone can't go to Columbia, everyone can't go to MIT. Lots of people are studying political science. They want to get a little bit of knowledge about the business end, as much as we as amateurs can provide, and he had the idea of coming up with this summer program, which is going on for 15, 20 years now? How many? 17 years, amazing program. Bringing people from all over the United States and the world, young people, to study the kinds of things that we care about so much and we think are so important. And it's another terrific contribution, and it's another great moment. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Dick Betts. I don't think he's going to blush. He's as cool as a cucumber as he always is. And please join me in welcoming him tonight.
Well, thanks for those excessively kind words, Barry. When I heard I was going to be here for this occasion and give this talk, the first thing that came into my mind was remembering reading Captain Ted Lawson's book, 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, when I was 12 years old, and seeing the 1944 movie with Spencer Tracy playing Jimmy Doolittle. And I also remembered my Revell B-25 model, which was one of my treasures way back in the 1950s. But I guess the second thing that came into my mind was the Doolittle Report of 1954, which was a famous assessment of the organization of covert intelligence operations that he oversaw for President Eisenhower. And the report I encountered when I was working on the staff of the First Senate investigation of the intelligence community, the Church Committee, now 37 years ago. But it's clear Doolittle was properly distinguished for much more than what first occurred to me, especially in technology of aeronautics. So it's certainly appropriate for MIT to celebrate its alumnus, and I'm genuinely honored and grateful to have been chosen to give this talk, to enjoy the happy occasion. So thank you. Deterrence isn't what it used to be. At least that's the feeling I had when I thought about giving this talk. Deterrence used to be where the action is in U.S. military policy. During the Cold War, one hardly heard any discussion of strategy that wasn't peppered with the word. And indeed, deterrence became a buzzword. It was used reflexively to justify anything that someone believed should be done in national security policy. The only word probably that was more overused was defense, but usually to note the benign national purpose for which deterrence was the preferred strategy. In proper usage, for my purposes, deterrence means preventing an adversary from attacking by threatening to impose costs that exceed gains, primarily by defeating the attack, denial, or destroying valued assets in retaliation, punishment. And when the term was not used mindlessly, deterrence reflected the highest American priority, containing Soviet military power, containing the Soviet Union militarily without war. And in a world of nuclear weapons, deterrence and containment became synonyms. Today, I think deterrence is no longer the primary concept driving strategy. It's probably not even secondary, but tertiary or less. Behind defense, in the literal sense, preemption and preventive war. The lower estate of the concept is seen in how widely policymakers reject it as a way to deal with nuclear proliferation. Even after 7 disastrous years of war in Iraq, the main criticism leveled among the foreign policy elite is that it was unnecessary because Saddam Hussein turned out not to have the WMD programs assumed. Not that deterrence could have sufficed for avoiding such a war, even if the WMD did exist. On the prospect of Iranian nuclear weapons, most of the debate inside the Beltway now is not about whether to attack Iran's nuclear installations, but when. Deterrence may remain the dovish position, but that makes it untenable as a practical matter in national security policy these days. The containment and deterrence option has been conflated with appeasement. The more relevant moderate position seems to have become neither accommodation nor deterrence, but preventive war at a later date, rather than soon, if sanctions and diplomacy don't turn Tehran away from deciding to build a bomb. President Obama declared, quote, "Iran's leaders should understand that I do not have a policy of containment. I have a policy to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon," end quote. Now, granted, this may be brinkmanship designed to avoid war by frightening Tehran into a deal, but it does box the president into a prospective choice between starting another war or craven retreat from a commitment if things don't work out as he hopes. I think deterrence has receded in appeal for 2 sets of reasons. First, the changed circumstances of the post-Cold War world make many see it variously as an ineffective, inapplicable, or illegitimate response to current threats. Second, the strategic alternatives to deterrence seem more acceptable than they were in the Cold War. Now, some of these are good reasons and bear stronger consideration than some devotees of deterrence accord to them on this point. I think the image practitioners have of academics as naively fixated on elegant theories rather than the complexities of real life has something to it, but some of the objections to deterrence are simply misconceptions. And on balance, I think deterrence is now far too undervalued. I'd say that I don't have confidence in deterrence as a solution to dealing with potential threats like Iran. I just believe that in the hardest cases, it's less risky than the alternatives. The challenges to national security in recent years seem to come mainly from terrorists or from governments in the hands of leaders too wild and crazy to be cowed by threats of retaliation. Now, deterrence is not entirely irrelevant to terrorism. Elaborate efforts at defense, such as huge American investments in intelligence, airline and port security, tightened visa requirements, control of dangerous substances, and so on, may foster deterrence by denial if they discourage some potential terrorists from even trying. Deterrence by punishment, however, is far less practical. Suicide terrorism as a specific form refutes deterrence by punishment on its face. You can hardly stop someone who's trying to kill himself by threatening him with death. Now, one might do it by threatening to kill all of his extended family, but that's not an option for the United States. For terrorists who want to live, the problem is that deterrence requires a return address against which retaliation can be visited. And that's what's lacking precisely for secretive groups. If we knew where they were well enough to retaliate, we could capture or kill them in the first place. The same obstacle to identifying targets, the attribution problem, frustrates deterrence of cyber warfare. Even if the origins of a cyber attack can be traced to a particular country, it's still impossible, at least I'm told, being technologically incompetent myself, but it's impossible to know the perpetrator for sure, whether it's the government, a group of patriotic hackers, or an individual commandeering an innocent computer. Dangerous governments are quite another matter. Tehran is a return address, and Iranians have not shown a penchant for suicide. Yet American officials seem to fear that fanatics in Tehran will not be constrained by the prospect of annihilation in return if they were to be reckless enough to use nuclear weapons first. Now, many consider it naive to place any faith in the rationality in Western terms of other cultures, or the self-preservation instinct of nasty leaders, or the priority either would put on avoiding physical devastation of their societies. Related to this worry about irrationality or miscalculation, skepticism today is sometimes rationalized by pointing to the alleged weakness of deterrence in the past. For example, deterrence is often said to have failed against Germany in 1939, Japan in 1941, North Korea in 1950, and Iraq in 1980 and 1990. This is really true only for Japan, although even then the failure that led to Pearl Harbor was as much one of compellence and provocation as of deterrence. The criticism is only partly true for Hitler. He might have been deterred from attacking Poland if his European enemies had combined against him at the outset. But he circumvented deterrence by detaching the Soviet Union from the Western coalition and the Non-Aggression Pact. Although the view of Hitler as irrationally undeterrable may be best supported by his gratuitous declaration of war on the United States a few days after Pearl Harbor. The view of the other three cases as failures of American deterrence is thoroughly mistaken, because Washington did not try to deter in any of them. In the year before the North Korean attack, both Secretary of State Acheson and General MacArthur made public statements excluding South Korea from the U.S. defense perimeter in the Pacific. The Carter administration, which was locked in a bitter conflict, a struggle over hostages in Tehran at the embassy, made no effort to deter Iraq from attacking Iran. And Ambassador April Glaspie conveyed no threat of American response before the invasion of Kuwait. I think it's a reasonable bet that both of the wars in 1950 and 1991 would probably have been avoided if a U.S. promise to fight had been made in advance. Applicability of deterrence is also discouraged by the renewed clout of legal and moral norms of warfare that were eclipsed for about a half a century after 1940. The most fearsome and the most potent form of deterrence, the threat to attack civilian populations systematically, has been thoroughly delegitimized. The psychology of total war that made the leveling of German and Japanese cities an easily accepted strategy in World War II, or that made the plan to kill hundreds of millions of Soviet, East European, and Chinese civilians in a potential World War III, hardly controversial in that half century, is passé. Even conventional bomb targeting is now a process in which lawyers keep a hand on the shoulder of military officers. Standard old-form nuclear deterrence would now be widely considered the plotting of a huge war crime. This could change back, and the potential for Americans to become ferociously callous about enemy populations once again shouldn't be underestimated in the event of a shock worse than September 11th that could be traced back to a national government. But that would be after a disaster that is what deterrence is supposed to prevent. Of all the reasons for the reduced role of deterrence, two stand out: unipolarity and the distribution of nuclear weapons capability. The United States is less focused on deterrence in recent years because it doesn't have to be. Deterrence was certainly understood and practiced before 1945, but it wasn't before then the highly articulated and sanctified concept that emerged to dominate thinking in the Cold War. That happened because there was no strategic alternative for confronting the other superpower, especially when it had the capability to annihilate us. Both bipolarity and nuclear weapons made mutual deterrence the outstanding reality, a strategy imposed by necessity in a world of military equals. And at different times, Kenneth Waltz cited both of these developments as the reason for the perversely comforting stability of the Cold War, although it was a stability not appreciated by very many people except Ken and a few other academics until after the fact. But as long as deterrence can be unilateral rather than mutual, it can function without being remarked or pondered. Only when the metaphor of scorpions in a bottle circling each other endlessly came to bound strategic options did deterrence become the focus of policy and theory in the Cold War period. With unipolarity, practical alternatives to deterrence may be unwise, but they're not insane. In any case, they're back with a vengeance. With the exception of North Korea, whose nuclear capability is still very weak, none of the world's existing nuclear powers are, at least quite yet, out-and-out enemies of the United States. Nor are any U.S. enemies major states above the status of a medium power. U.S. primacy means never having to say we have no other choice but deterrence. Three basic alternatives are now more feasible and thus more popular than during the Cold War. Defense is more technologically and economically feasible. Preemption is less dangerous, and preventive war is wrong-headed but not suicidal. First, defense. Cold War strategy combined conventional and nuclear deterrence, but the emphasis was on the ultimate nuclear level. Even most proponents of improved NATO conventional forces, in order to reduce reliance on escalation, argued for the doctrine of flexible response, not no first use. Here I'm talking about the sort of the relevant elites that had influence on policy, not the fringes of the political debate. For the nuclear level, there was recurrent controversy about whether to rely completely on nuclear deterrence to prevent nuclear attack, or to invest in active and passive defenses to cope with it in case deterrence failed. After the late 1960s, however, even proponents of active defense argued for it as an alternative that might be attained in the future, not a viable option at the time, because offensive forces were just too numerous to interdict with much effectiveness. After all, the United States and the Soviet Union had between 9,000 and 11,000 so-called strategic nuclear weapons apiece, most mounted on ballistic missiles with highly favorable estimated exchange ratios in engagements with interceptors. Bipolarity meant that if offensive forces had the proportional advantage technologically, both sides had enough resources to compete effectively in neutralizing each other's defensive deployments. Today, the situation is different, at least in regard to the prospective threats of most concerned at present, medium-sized rogue states, so-called, that are likely to have only a modest number of nuclear weapons and at best a few expensive and probably not the most technologically advanced ICBMs with all sorts of bells and whistle countermeasures and so on. All their means of delivery, apart from clandestine insertion, and that's, I think, a very important exception, all their other means of delivery are potentially vulnerable to air defenses or ballistic missile defenses that would only have to engage a handful of attacking missiles rather than hundreds. If such states are undeterrable, as alarmists claim, they would still lack resources to penetrate a serious defense system, at least in large numbers with overt means. Now, it would remain difficult to neutralize the large number of missiles Russia retains, but I believe there is no longer any reason other than inertia to count Russia as a serious enemy. I have this naive belief that the Cold War really is over. Or if wrong-headed conventional wisdom continues to see strategic stability with Russia as something that needs to be institutionalized, old-fashioned arms control could logically do this on a defense-dominant basis, at least in terms of American and NATO interests. If Washington and Moscow reduced their offensive forces to a few hundred weapons but deployed large active defense systems, they could still deter medium-sized power threats while at least raising the possibility of moving towards immunity from each other. The obstacle to this technologically logical alternative, if it were to become feasible, isn't just conservatism in the West, but Russia's new interest in relying on nuclear first use to deter NATO. The tables have turned since the Cold War, with apparent overwhelming conventional superiority now residing in the Western alliance. If both Moscow and the West could get over even half of the residual instincts of Cold War enmity, the alternative just hypothesized, I think at least shouldn't be dismissed out of hand. The second alternative that becomes more admissible under unipolarity than it was during the Cold War is preemption. Now here I'm speaking of preemption in the literal and correct sense, not the sloppy usage that confuses it with preventive war, a confusion that wasn't just fostered by the last Bush administration, but unfortunately is by pundits and even many experts who should know better. Preemption means beating the enemy to the draw, striking first when the enemy is preparing an imminent attack. In contrast, preventive attack is launched against an adversary who might decide to attack in the future, but isn't yet planning to do so. In the literal sense, preemption's only anticipatory defense in a conflict initiated by the enemy. A strategy of preemption was not a safe alternative to deterrence in the Cold War because, first, it couldn't prevent devastating retaliation, and second, it risked starting a war that might otherwise be avoided, the problem of crisis stability. The Cold War competition presented the distilled and extreme form of the security dilemma, the tragic situation in which competitors have to cope with uncertainty about whether their opposite numbers are interested in committing unprovoked aggression or want, above all, to avoid war. In a crisis between the superpowers, it couldn't have been absolutely certain whether the other's military preparations were signals of definite intent to attack or precautionary mobilization and deployment in readiness to defend. Without absolute certainty, the cost of suffering retaliation after imperfect preemption in this nuclear world just made the risk too great. Today, though, American enemies are far weaker than the Soviet Union was. If we can find them well enough to strike preemptively, we can probably cripple their capacity to strike back, and it is certainly better than waiting to be struck first, if indeed that is the imminent probability. If we can find a terrorist, there's no reason to hold back from capturing or killing him, since there's scant doubt that he'll strike if he gets the chance. Now, if there's any doubt that some weaker enemy is definitely preparing to attack, the consequences of guessing wrong, at least, are far lower than they would have been in, say, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Preventive war is a very different matter. If the enemy has not already set plans to attack in motion, striking first cuts off real possibilities of defusing conflict. War is never inevitable, and the longer the time horizon, the more the chances of cooling tensions, negotiation, rapprochement, realignment, or the adversary's collapse, all of which happened with the Soviet Union and China at various points along the way in the Cold War. Nevertheless, preventive war has become a more respectable and popular alternative to deterrence in the 21st century. It was undertaken against Iraq in 2003. Despite what I consider the awful results of that adventure, Washington is now implicitly threatening to do it against Iran if it gives evidence of actually developing a nuclear weapon. Now, this time the war would be limited, air attack alone, and given the occasion, I would be the last to disparage the significance of air power, but in this situation, I believe it would vitiate the benefits of avoiding entanglement on the ground by being less decisive in its result. Preventive war is being more explicitly threatened by Israel. That country has had its own dubious experiences with preventive war against Egypt in 1956 and Lebanon in 1982, but takes its lessons from the less costly preventive strikes against nuclear reactors in Iraq in 1981 and Syria a few years ago. To me, the arguments against preventive war are overwhelming. And if that doesn't seem intuitively obvious to you, you can get my full argument in Chapter 6 of my recent book, American Force, if I may put in a plug for it, but which I'll summarize just very briefly here. First, the conventional wisdom about the Osirak attack, I believe, is wrong. It did not demonstrably delay Iraq's progress toward obtaining a nuclear weapon, but probably accelerated it. Now, I think the Syrian case is probably different and may have been a correct choice. There's still a lot we don't know about it. Second, even proponents of air attack on Iran's nuclear installations admit that it would only delay, not terminate, the nuclear weapons project. And they seem to me to ignore the probability that what little is gained from delaying capability will be negated by inflaming intentions. I think this inattention to how the effects on intentions can worsen a threat is widespread and dangerous. A threat equals capabilities times intentions, or as I put it simplistically on the blackboard to my students, T equals C times I. Only if either one is reduced to zero does the threat go away, and if reduction in one causes comparable increase in the other, the threat is not necessarily reduced. The third point, arguments for why the gains of preventive war against Iran outweigh the risks, echo logic, and advanced in arguments for preventive war against Stalin's USSR and Mao's China. The epically catastrophic folly that accepting those arguments then would have produced is obvious, given the way history turned out. Fourth, the record of deterrence in handling big threats in earlier times, when the deterrent commitment was made clear, is, it seems to me, pretty satisfactory. Yet what seems clear to me, and probably to many of you, appears to have lost the battle in Washington. From outside, at least, I'm not plugged in the Beltway anymore. I've been away for 20 years. But from the outside, it seems that the main debate is now about whether U.S. intelligence can provide confidence in warning of an Iranian decision to proceed with manufacturing a bomb so that we can afford to defer an attack to that later date. Not whether relying on deterrence as a way to live with Iranian nuclear weapons could be the lesser evil among these choices. The dovish position seems to be to kick the preventive war can down the road, or the moderate position at least, not to endorse deterrence as an alternative. It would be easier to take comfort in the supposition that policymakers have faith in deterrence as a fallback, even if they don't admit it, or that they'll come to accept it if forced to find a fallback. It would be easier to take comfort from that if President Obama had not gone out as far on the limb rhetorically as he did. Fans of deterrence might naively argue that because it was the fundamental and overriding strategy that got us through the Cold War, enabling victory without firing a shot against the main adversary, it should be an attractive model for handling the much punier threats of the post-Cold War world. This argument seems to have more traction among scholars than among those responsible for action in the real world. And deterrence may always have had more traction with theorists than with practitioners, something I think our own professional amour propre may sometimes obscure. Deterrence isn't what it used to be, but maybe it never really was. It was indeed the main consistent underlying strategy of the Cold War, but not the only one, not without challenge, not always in the way theorists emphasized, and not for the whole time. Many academic theorists overlook the significance of the exceptions and underestimate the reasons policymakers feel to mistrust reliance on deterrence. In the early Cold War, the dominant American attitude towards deterrence was that it was something to be applied unilaterally for the United States to constrain the Soviet Union, or something temporary until the Iron Curtain could be rolled back. The alternative of preventive war against the Soviet Union in the early 1950s and China in the early 1960s was seriously discussed at high levels. And while this option did not make it to the status of a plan, preemption certainly did. SAC's orientation to striking first, at least in the first half of the Cold War, is no longer a secret. The era of near consensus on the durability of mutual deterrence as a basis for peace was not an era, but really not much more than about a dozen years, from the late 1960s to 1980. The same period, by the way, I think, in which most people, at least in my generation of strategic studies, formed their conceptual orientations. This period, which coincided with general American retreat from military activism due to the disaster in Vietnam, witnessed diplomatic détente, which eased the political inhibitions against accepting nuclear vulnerability, and the rise of the strategic arms limitation talks to center stage in U.S.-Soviet relations, which offered the prospect of institutionalized stability. Official rhetoric, such as Robert McNamara's proclamation of assured destruction as the criterion for adequacy of U.S. nuclear forces. By the way, a lot of people forget that he never endorsed mutual assured destruction. It was assured destruction of the other guy that was the point, but that's another matter. Anyway, things like that encouraged all outside the secret world of the PSYOP to infer mistakenly the abandonment of the counterforce mission and to believe that mutual deterrence had been set in concrete as a good norm rather than a temporary necessity. In this period, the hawks of nuclear strategy were sidelined, temporarily whining in the wilderness. The ABM and SALT I treaties were ratified with virtually no opposition. Within a decade, though, things changed. Now, before this period of near consensus, U.S. policy was committed to keeping offensive nuclear superiority. Now, Dove sometimes point to things like Eisenhower's many indications that he considered nuclear war unthinkable. But on his watch, military planning, which was something he would not have overlooked, did not deviate from the aim of winning any war with Moscow and winning it in a meaningful sense. After Kennedy, policymakers may have lost faith in the option of keeping meaningful superiority, but they continued to endorse it until the late 1960s. After the hiatus period of consensus on living like scorpions in a bottle, the Reagan administration's Strategic Defense Initiative repudiated mutual assured destruction as an acceptable basis for stability. Now, devotees of deterrence saw this as a bad regression that could be repealed when a more sensible administration came to power, but no administration after Reagan's went back on the return to defense. Even Bill Clinton, who staffed his administration with people who in the old days would have fallen on their swords for arms control, stuck with the goal of strategic defense in principle. I think personally, because by that time it seemed so unimportant, he just didn't want to waste any political capital on it, but the fact remains. Now, of course, none of this before or after the period of pro-deterrence consensus represented any rejection of the desirability of deterrence. It just reflected a lack of willingness to rely on it. In the period before the temporary consensus, the logic of deterrence didn't play out in practice quite as neatly as in theory. First, the Soviets and Chinese viewed the concept of deterrence in its American form as a coercive, aggressive one, rather than a threat with a passive, dissuasive, benign purpose. The translation of the word deterrence in Russian and Mandarin was usually closer to intimidation. At least this is what I'm told by people who know the languages. And I personally remember a very confusing and a strident exchange of accusations in a conference in Beijing about 15 years ago about the translation of the word and what the American delegation was saying. Chaz Freeman, who not only knows Arabic but knows what he hears when he hears Chinese, kept interjecting, saying, "That's not what we said," when we used the word deterrence. And that sort of conceptual confusion is not insignificant. In Schelling's terms, our adversaries tended to see our deterrence as compellence. Second, the finest hour of American power in the Cold War, in the view of many, was the Cuban Missile Crisis, an exercise in high-stakes compellence. But it reflected the fact that rather than accept a Soviet deployment that would undercut U.S. nuclear superiority, yet would even stay short of establishing equality, but would increase the vulnerability of U.S. territory, Washington went to the brink of war to roll it back. Kennedy was not deterred by Moscow's finite deterrent. Moreover, the United States remained committed throughout the Cold War to flexible response and the threat of deliberate nuclear first use in the event of a war in Europe. Now, this was for deterrence, of course, deterrence of Soviet conventional attack in Europe. But, in my view, despite lots of convoluted attempts to square the circle, NATO doctrine, in this respect, contradicted the logic of mutual nuclear deterrence, which rested on the principle that initiation of nuclear war would be suicide. Now, make no mistake, I don't mean to imply that at any time after the middle of the Cold War, policymakers reached the point where they thought the mutuality of deterrence could be overturned soon. And even in the 1950s, there was never confidence that we were undeterred by Moscow. Escape from vulnerability to Soviet nuclear weapons was an aspiration, never achieved, for reasons the fans of mutual deterrence considered insurmountable because of Soviet capacity to match us militarily. That is, because of bipolarity. The difference in today's unipolar world is that U.S. enemies can't match us, and other options do seem available to escape from being deterred by them. And as in the Cold War, whatever the motive for nuclear capability may be, its targets will see it as a compellant threat rather than a deterrent. I don't mean to make too much of the divergence between prevalent theory and rhetoric on one hand and actions and practice on the other. Some of academic strategic studies recognized it well, especially the empirical revelations of ferrets like Bruce Blair, Scott Sagan, Desmond Ball, David Allen Rosenberg, Fred Kaplan, as evidence about war plans and development of targeting doctrine became available in the 1980s. But the view that these deviations don't matter and that deterrence is a rock-solid basis for peace has deep roots on our side of the theory-practice divide. Academic strategic studies that are oriented to deductive logic and theoretical simplification, I think, have often glossed over the exceptions to the main point, the robustness of deterrence. They've glossed over the exceptions as insignificant nuances or analytical mistakes that didn't alter the dominance of deterrence as strategy for the nuclear era. Most theorists of nuclear strategy remained devoted to the abstract logic of crisis stability, reciprocal fear of surprise attack, and the ineluctability of mutual assured destruction as the alternative to mutual deterrence. The fact that nuclear deterrence between the superpowers never failed and may have underwritten the long peace in Europe accounts for much of academic strategists' devotion to it. And for the most part, this is as it should be, since theory never matches reality neatly and isn't supposed to. Theorists focus on the main point, kept as simple as it can be without becoming simplistic, shorn of most qualifications and nuances, with exceptions relegated to footnotes. In social science, which is, I hate to disillusion the graduate students here, but which is still less scientific than natural science, a theory that accounts for 9 out of 10 cases is an extraordinarily impressive theory. Practitioners who have responsibility for what happens as a result of their actions, however, are more interested in the exceptions and complexities. Because for them, when it comes to nuclear weapons, 9 out of 10 isn't good enough. Well, I've been talking about decline, not demise. Deterrence certainly is not moribund. Moreover, the alternatives to deterrence can contribute to it. Visibly effective defenses, or making examples of enemies by effective preemption, or even, perhaps, preventive war. It's possible that the Israeli attack on Osirak or the U.S. invasion of Iraq encouraged other Arab governments to turn away from nuclear weapons programs they might have been interested in trying. One test of the relevance of deterrence is how U.S. policy affects its adversaries' interest in it as a strategy, and whether we'll end up deterring them or from acquiring their own deterrent or provoking them to get one as soon as possible. Reliance on deterrence may seem unnecessary or unattractive to a hegemonic power facing inferior enemies, or it may seem less than optimal but satisfactory to equal powers facing each other, but it can easily be a thoroughly desirable option for a weak country facing a strong adversary. So will preventive wars convince hostile but weak countries that attempting to get an equalizer will only bring on the American onslaught they want the deterrent to prevent? Or will manhandling weak countries that lack nuclear weapons convince them that nuclear weapons are all that can protect them? When policymakers are asked why there's so much hysteria about potential Iranian nuclear weapons, but no one is beating the drum to attack North Korea, which already has some, they answer, it's too late. Now that North Korea has crossed the threshold, we can't do anything. That reasoning concedes deterrent capability to Pyongyang. Now, of course, there are other reasons which are probably more significant. Unlike lonely Iran, North Korea does have some hefty friends, or one in particular. But it does, at least in principle, suggest that even a small nuclear capability is something that will be too late for us to deal with if we don't make great sacrifices to nip it before it buds. Washington has also not done all it could to make a non-proliferation bargain credible to regimes we don't like. Muammar Gaddafi surrendered his nascent nuclear program in favor of a strategy of appeasement rather than deterrence. Within several years, however, Washington remembered only what an odious tyrant he was and rewarded him by ousting him from power and getting him killed. Which of these two cases should we expect Tehran to take as a lesson? A preventive war against Iran to end all preventive wars, to coin a phrase, might be considered worthwhile. But the more likely prospect that other cases would follow, reinforcing the 21st century trend of permanent war in foreign policy, in American foreign policy, makes the rehabilitation of deterrence as an alternative important. But how can academics contribute to this? I wish I had a better answer than perhaps the disappointingly obvious one of saying by providing more careful scorecards of how preventive wars achieve their objectives at an acceptable price, and how often deterrence has failed in situations moderately comparable to ones we face prospectively with antagonists like Iran and North Korea. And personally, I think it wouldn't hurt to do more to sensitize our students to more of the ambiguities about thinking about deterrence that people in the real world who could do something about it actually had, would be a good idea. although I find myself these days, for whatever reason, that I can't get students interested in anything beyond the bare bones of mutual assured destruction as the essence of nuclear strategy. Their eyes glaze over when I try to make things any more complicated. But I hope not out of misplaced nostalgia. I think it would be useful if they did. Well, rather than drone on, maybe we should see what you want to discuss.
I guess just to follow up on the most, well, sort of your last comment there, I would love to hear what you think the reason is that your students glaze over when they talk about anything other than mutually assured destruction, what the problem is. And then the broader question is sort of where security studies is, where there's security studies in 2012. It'd be great to hear some sort of broad, especially given our speaker.
The 30-second answer to
as concise as you like to make it, I would love to hear you wax rhapsodic on that topic.
On the first point, I don't know, but I suspect it's because in the post-Cold War era, people are not as fixated on the centrality of weapons of mass destruction. I find this in the master's degree program in our School of International and Public Affairs, where I direct the security policy concentration. I can't get many students to take the course on weapons of mass destruction taught by your distinguished alumnus, Austin Long. I explained to them, you may not think it's important now, but eventually one of these things are going to go off. Or if you thought September 11th was a surprise, think about the surprise that can happen in your lifetime, blah, blah, blah. I think they just don't think that's where the interest is. I think they think of at least nuclear strategy on a highly articulated, intellectualized level is a relic of the Cold War. I don't know what the other explanation may be. On security studies, I have to confess I'm at a loss. I don't know how to answer that in the time that would be reasonable. I have a now somewhat aging, but I think still relevant article in the 50th anniversary edition of World Politics called Should Strategic Studies Survive, which was my take on it then. I think security studies, like many things we do in political science, despite our own pretensions, tend to follow fads or events in the real world. And people these days, or students at least, tend to be interested in ethnic conflict, civil wars, and things of that sort, rather than great power conflict and the titanic struggles for world supremacy of the past. Even though they know, well, yes, China's a superpower is on the horizon, I find most attention focused on those immediate vexing problems. Academically, I consider my mission still to try to ground people in the basics, and that means the history of conflict among great powers and what it suggests, because great powers are still here, and even though they're getting along well at the moment, there's no reason to expect they will even through their lifetimes, and to give them a range of choices otherwise about what to do rather than to put them through a rigid sequence of attention to specific issues. But to give you a satisfactory answer, I'd have to take a lot longer. Sorry.
Aaron.
I'm always concerned. Well, first of all, thank you. Very interesting. I'm very concerned about the use of the word deterrence. As you indicated, it has two meanings. One is to prevent an attack, and the other is a very aggressive meaning, which you called repellence, which is to make or to try to make somebody cease and desist from doing something. For example, Iran should cease and desist from developing a nuclear weapon, if that's really what the game is. So the fact that one word is used for both things deeply bothers me, and I would like your commentary on this.
I think it's a problem. It was even more problem during the Cold War, I think, because it became such a buzzword that it was used to cover everything. If you wanted to buy a new model of the F-16, it was justified for deterrence. Or if anything you wanted to do was for deterrence, because that was what our strategy was supposedly all about, even if in the specific operational matters that most issues in defense policy revolved around, that was not what it was about. There are a couple of problems. One is that outside specialists who contemplate our navals all the time, most people are nonchalant about how they use terms that are a little bit arcane to them. And secondly, there's the problem, as I suggested, of how it's translated. If there's confusion about it in English, there's bound to be confusion when you're dealing with the concept cross-culturally or across languages. And I don't know any solution to that other than the probably impractical one of sponsoring conferences on etymology and proper definition, which is probably a non-starter. But properly used, in the American sense, deterrence was a benign, really unthreatening kind of threat. That was, as long as you don't hurt us, you got nothing to worry about. But as I indicated and you picked up on, it is often not seen that way. The same way we probably don't see programs that may be motivated by the desire to deter us as innocent either. And I don't know a solution to that. It's almost inherent, that international uncertainty is almost inherent in the uncertainty of international politics.
I see a dip in the rank. It's been moved to action, so I'm going to...
Well, I mean, I really appreciate your talk, and I think this point you make about how the United States has never really accepted mutual vulnerability is really important as we start talking about China. And I think there's a real debate now as to whether policymakers and practitioners of deterrence really accept mutual vulnerability with the Chinese as we go forward. And prompt global strike, missile defenses, if you have small arsenals, if that's true, then the structural incentive for states like Russia, China, even Pakistan is to rapidly increase your arsenals. The only point at which we accept a mutual vulnerability is when the Soviet arsenal was just so big that we couldn't practically think about splendid first strike. So I was wondering if you could talk about what the incentives are for not small nuclear powers, but medium nuclear powers like China as we go forward. And also this tension then between the administration talking about nuclear zero, right? At the same time, we're talking about ramping down, right? Maybe the cynical interpretation of that is if we can go in lockstep down and get the Russians and the Chinese to keep arsenals small, and we develop missile defenses and have advanced and accurate prompt global strike capabilities, this is really the condition of nuclear superiority. So I was wondering if you could talk about whether, how you see the administration playing with these two different pressures.
Well, in China, as far as I can tell, which is limited, I think debate about this is overdue. I'm sure that specialists and groups of people among analysts or at middle levels in both governments are thinking about this. But to me, sort of the most serious phase is when people at a high level of responsibility have at least a cursory consciousness that this is an issue. As people at the undersecretary or cabinet level in this country did about the logic of mutual deterrence in some form or other. But at least I don't hear much evidence of people at high levels saying anything or thinking about the implications of the U.S. ballistic missile defense program for Chinese expansion of their missile force. And if it's being discussed at high levels in China, I don't know about it, since I depend mostly on what I read in the New York Times. But it seems to me an obvious question, because if the United States deploys even a rudimentarily effective ballistic missile defense system, that's going to force a major choice on the Chinese about changing their trivial investment in a finite deterrent. I confess to not keeping up with all of the data carefully. It's been a while since I checked the numbers, but last time I checked, the number of ICBMs estimated for China was 18. It may be more now, but not many more.
The DF-31 is, as it starts replacing the DF-5, those are mobile, and a lot of the
Right. All I mean is it's still a very small number, because under the logic of finite deterrence, which the Chinese seem to buy, and which many rational people have often bought in this country, even if others have disagreed on controlled policy, that should be enough. But if 30 or 40 of those can be drawn down by defenses to a much smaller number, and if it looks like the United States is going to get into effective strategic defense in a significant way, and even if the defenses aren't very good, if they see us deploying them, they're going to estimate they're better than they really are, then that's a recipe for, to some degree, recreating the arms competition of the Cold War. Now, maybe everyone will be smarter on both sides the next time around than, with hindsight now, it seems perhaps we were in the Cold War, but I wouldn't count on it. Anyway, I'm a little surprised that this hasn't become a more audible, large debate. I think it's mainly an issue for China because China has the potential to really compete, has the potential to reestablish bipolarity. If trends continue, and of course that's always a dangerous assumption, if economic development goes off the rails and so on, maybe won't have to worry about it, but that's the one that, as on so many other issues, poses the biggest potential challenge. Iran, I don't know, I guess they've got a lot of money, and presumably they could sink a lot of it into trying to develop a spiffy nuclear force, but I can't imagine that in a serious competition with the United States, it would pan out very significantly. And most other countries I think that we would worry about, with the exception of Pakistan, which has its own unique set of dangerous uncertainties, are not likely to have a big enough force to make this sort of offense-defense interaction a big issue. I don't have any careful thoughts about how reductions in line with the global zero movement would affect everything. My instinct is that for practical purposes, this is not a serious eventuality to plan for. On the other hand, what has struck me, is the number of very serious former responsible officials, I mean, including a former commander of SAC and others, who have signed on to this. And I think probably not disingenuously, but maybe because people who've dealt seriously with this question come around to thinking, my God, if we don't do something radical, these things are eventually going to go off. So that's the one reason I don't write off this movement as purely symbolic and irrelevant, but it's hard for me to imagine what the precise impacts of some sort of incremental progress in that direction would have. The main issue in a lot of this is the U.S.-Russian relationship, and as I said, I'm perhaps out of step on this, but it seems to me that Russia is an irritant and a regime that we don't like in a lot of ways, maybe even more than we get irritated by the French, but it's not like the world in which, A, they were twice as powerful as they are now relatively, and B, where there was a titanic ideological struggle for the future of the world, which created a real basis for conflict. So that's why it seems to me, if logic were to prevail, we ought to be able to have a nuclear relationship with the Russians not radically different than what we have with the French, but that thinking is not very representative of anybody who matters.
Chris Clare.
I wonder if I could make the case for limited airstrikes against Iran along 3 fronts, and if you could push back against some combination of 3. One is, if you could delay the program by 5 to 10 years, that matters, because there's a stochastic process that leads to regime change in that part of the world. And it seems like after a few years, people don't remember an airstrike. The Syrian protesters in Homs and elsewhere don't seem to remember in 2007, doesn't seem to slow them down. So 5 to 10 years could matter. You could get a different regime could be better. So the airstrikes could achieve real effect, not just delay. Second avenue would be, it's
it's not just deterrence. I could buy conventional and nuclear deterrence could hold, but I could worry about subconventional things. Pakistanis have shown it's very difficult to stop subconventional threats from a nuclear state. A lot of Shia in eastern Saudi Arabia and throughout the GCC states, that's an area we care about. It's very difficult to deter subconventional activities by a nuclear armed state. Avenue 2. Avenue 3 is if Iran goes, other states will go. And eventually, if you have enough of these states, these things hang around. And Ken Waltz, his argument basically was it's really tough to get nukes. So the states that get nukes are pretty stable, and so we don't have to worry about it. But North Korea, Pakistan, perhaps Iran, Syria, shows that you can have very unstable states that get nuclear weapons. The ability of these regimes to secure them is relatively low. And the real threat is not some missile from Iran, but the fact that one of these things gets smuggled into the US or Europe and goes off in a city. And so you want to stop that from happening, and to stop that, you really have to stop Iran, because that's really the only threat on the horizon. If you stop Iran, it's not clear who the other state is that's going to lead to this cascade of proliferation.
Well, let me say first, I'm a pessimist by nature, and I always tell my students what I like about being a pessimist is I'm happy to be proved wrong, and I often am. So, if policymakers follow my advice and Iran gets a nuclear weapon and uses it against Israel or wherever, despite what is bound to happen to them, then I will be proved wrong. And I'll apologize. But these judgments, I think, ultimately are subjective judgments about murky, interacting, hard to estimate probabilities. And so, I'll just give you what seems to me to be the most salient considerations, but it's a subjective judgment. First of all, if you attack Iran, the idea of maintenance bombing every few years to keep them down, I think, is not practical. I don't think that would be politically supportable over the long term. And you will have increased their incentives to rebuild their program in a more secret, more protected way, if they haven't already done so. Now I do some consulting in the intelligence community once in a while, but I know nothing about the real inside poop on what we know or what we know we don't know about Iranian installations. But I've done enough research in the past on intelligence failures that I just lack confidence that we can know what we don't know, or that we can assume that the Iranians are so stupid that they haven't seen this coming, that they haven't known they're in our crosshairs for years and haven't done something about it. Now, maybe it's impossible for them to hide anything significant and effective that would vitiate or circumvent the effectiveness of a strike. I would want more proof of that than I've seen, or that I think conforms to what one would logically deduce they would be trying to do. And it seems to me the political effects are strategically important, and it's hard to me to see that the political effects are generally good. Now, maybe the Saudis would be happy that we did their job for them, even though they would dump on us just like everybody else in the Muslim world, if not the Western world, for an unprovoked act of aggression. That's certainly how it would be presented in 98% of the places in the world. And I think you would probably turn what is now a divided Iranian population, which has lots of people who are quite pro-Western, into a united population against us. And it seems to me, well, if we knew what was going to happen, that would be a price worth paying. Given the risks and the likelihood of what would happen under the alternative, it's not a price worth paying. The idea that if Iran gets a bomb, it will lead to a cascade, well, maybe, but this has been said for 50 years about nuclear proliferation, that once such and such a country gets a weapon, then the dam will break. Now, maybe eventually that will be right. There's that famous speech of John Kennedy's at the United Nations in 1963, where he talked about the prospect, if I recall correctly, of a world of 25 nuclear powers in the 1970s. There are, happily, lots of disincentives to getting nuclear weapons that most countries recognize. The ones we worry about are the ones who have very strong positive incentives. And they tend these days to be countries that feel threatened by us. Some for good reason, because they're awful governments who do terrible things that we would like to change and that should be changed. But the idea that there will be a cascade, I think, is possible, but would not conform to the pattern of the past. There may be some other points, but if I've forgotten them, they're in Chapter 6 of my book, or an article I had in National Interest about 4 or 5 years ago.
So Owen Cote has claimed the special Owen Cote Q jumping principle.
No, it's just like, you've done it before, whatever.
But that's because I'm trusting in the two
Yeah, it's very, very
attributes
Just
of
on
the intervention.
one of Chris's points, which is, you're saying that you would like more confidence that the intelligence community is going to give you warning of a very serious secret effort by the Iranians to enrich uranium.
No. If I'm going to sign on to the utility of an attack, I would like more confidence that they haven't adapted in advance to minimizing the impact of that attack. Now, maybe there's grounds for that confidence.
I'm just saying that
But I haven't seen it.
we've now gone through this, we've gone literally through 2 full iterations of an Iranian attempt to covertly enrich uranium that failed, right, twice. So, I mean, it would seem to me that Donald Rumsfeld's challenge, which is that, the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, is starting to look a little stale in this case. I mean,
Well, it may be. All I'm saying is I haven't seen it, and I would simply be, no, I'm talking about, you don't know what you haven't seen. All I'm saying is I would not be surprised if, with all the imperfections of the equipment they have not put some stuff in places we don't know to target that matter. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's enough to make a strike totally ineffective. It just seems to me we're talking about effectiveness at the margins. Nobody's claiming that it's going to eliminate the program. Now, granted, it may delay it or set it back indefinitely so that it never gets to where it wants to go. But if you're talking about limited effects, and there is one way to take military action that would guarantee that Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapon, and that's to do what we did to Iraq in 2003. But that's out of the question.
But see, this is, I'm sorry, Barry, but this is the reason why it's important to get this issue of whether your intelligence community is telling you the truth of what's really going on. Because again, the same uncertainty that you're talking about to use as an argument against striking Iran was the argument for invading Iraq. So it cuts both ways, right? It's really important, to be. Is it really true that if we're really looking and we're paying a lot of attention and we're using all of the assets that we have, which we're clearly doing with Iran now, that we might not?
Yeah, I don't know.
Donald Rumsfeld's
I don't know.
argument was what you're saying, and that was why we had to invade Iraq.
Invasion's different than bombing.
Of course it is, but the point is that uncertainty can be used politically for both purposes. And so, as far as I'm concerned, I really want to home in on this question about, is it really uncertain? Because you could make the argument that it wasn't that uncertain in the first case, right? There was other impetus behind going in there. We knew, right? We knew there was no nuclear program. The British said it. Anyways, that's it.
No, don't get me started on that. They really did believe there were WMD in Iraq.
That's different. Nuclear versus WMD is different.
Now, look, I'm not saying this has probably happened or definitely happened. All I'm saying is I would be surprised if there wasn't some attempt to do it, and maybe it would incrementally reduce the impact of what is an incremental measure to begin with. That's all I'm saying. And as I said before, that's a subjective judgment, I admit.
Joseph Teresi.
So tonight you've talked a lot about deterrence against medium-sized powers, and you've also mentioned that your focus broadly of your career has been over great power politics, which is what I'd like to ask you about. Over the last couple of years, there's been a lot of talk of this strategic pivot to Asia to deal with the rise of China. And I'm curious if you think the thinking behind this, the conceptual underpinnings, are some form of deterrence, and whether or not starting deterrence at this point might affect the formula you talked about of threat being both a relationship between intentions and capabilities.
My reaction to the speech and the talk of the pivot is that this isn't really news. What was significant was that the president talked about it, which I think was probably a mistake because it gets the Chinese all shook up for probably no good reason in terms of any meaningful change in U.S. policy. But there has been for quite a while, I think, an ambiguity about whether or to what extent the United States is trying to deter China. And I think there are both costs and benefits to that ambiguity. I think part of the reason is there hasn't been a firm, high-level decision about some sort of hard and fast strategy for dealing with China militarily over time. There's this general notion that we have to hedge against conflict in the future, and that's a good reason for important innovations in the Air Force and Navy and so on, but I don't think there's a clear commitment on this score. A lot of people talk about how, no, don't worry, to the Chinese, we're not into containment. But I think that's because containment, too, is a term that is sometimes misunderstood or mistranslated. I think from the American point of view, if you look back at what the term was originally meant to indicate, it was simply to prevent expansion, in which case, you can say, who could object to that? In fact, the United States shouldn't object to being contained. But the term containment does set people off as, in China, as a signal of intent to prevent China's rise, to keep China down, to maintain American hegemony. The real issue over time is whether we, I think, more decisively and formally adapt a policy that looks like it has clearly specified military components about keeping China in its place. And the main question will be over Taiwan if the present happy trends about cross-strait relations somehow go awry. What bothers me is that ambiguity is advantageous if the United States does not want to contain or deter China, but wants to get some residual benefit out of the ambiguity to make the Chinese think they might be in for more deterrence and containment. But if we do want to deter and contain China in the future, ambiguity, I think, is risky because it invites miscalculation. If we are going to adopt that clear a stance, there'd be some utility in saying so, at least at some point, lest a crisis arise like 1950 or 1990 or other times when country thought we'd essentially given them a green light and we changed our minds once it was brought to our attention.
Since we've been talking about China off and on, Bob Ross might have a China question, but he might not.
I will restrain myself from trying to be as succinct as you were in your 30 seconds. First, there's no ambiguity. Since 1997, we moved everything into Asia. F-22s, F-16s, F-35s to go next. Virginia-class, Los Angeles-class, war.
I'm talking about declaratory policy, yeah.
Chinese don't pay attention to what they say, they pay attention to what we do.
Okay.
There's no ambiguity.
So they're absolutely sure we'll fight for Taiwan.
They're absolutely Taiwan's not the issue. World wars and regional wars don't start over South Carolina. They start over regional balances.
I like your definitive.
Yeah. No more than Dick, though. That North Korea has been a success because it got nuclear weapons, and therefore we don't attack it.
That's a low bar for success. I don't think it's the envy of any country in the world right now.
That wasn't my point, but you're right.
You know, so that even though we may fail in preventing them and therefore we can't attack, I don't think that gives a green light to other countries that can go for it. They paid a heavy price. No one wants to be in that situation. But the larger question is, I wanted to bring you back to your talk. And that is on deterrence in the Cold War. And deterrence as a theory and a concept was central to the Cold War because it was, as you say, the critical issue in great power relations. And I share with you that. That's been my devotion, is understanding great power relations, because failure to manage great power relations will make 9/11 look like a picnic in the park, where we should be focused. The problem of the Soviet Union was that it already had the capability, we feared, to start a conventional war from conventional superiority. And once it reached nuclear parity, we feared mutually assured destruction. Both those scenarios in that great power relationship required focus on deterrence. The next great power relationship is not with the country that has those capabilities yet. We should not, if you care about great power relations as your field of study, we should not be studying deterrence as our number one theoretical interest. And I have no problem getting my students interested in China. And there are a lot of dissertations out there now about power transitions, hegemonic wars, so on and so forth, because that is the great power question of the day. So my question for you is, as a political scientist who does international security, what theories, we shouldn't do deterrence because we like deterrence, however critical remains to understanding of security affairs. If we care about great power relations, our research should evolve to do theoretical work on the central question. What theoretical questions should we be addressing in security studies to address the central great power relationship in the world?
Well, I think one you hinted at, especially in regard to Asia, is the variance of power transition theory and the alternatives to hegemonic war of transition. That's the big question. I like to believe that a new Cold War with China or worse is not inevitable, but it seems to me that it's the default option if we don't apply more than usually skillful ideas in diplomacy. That what will happen if nature just takes its course is a very dangerous, if not hegemonic transition, at least revivification of bipolarity. I'd be interested in theories of alternatives to confrontation that at least are more reassuring to me than the perennial popular ones about interdependence and economic integration and how those shared interests will override strategic competition because we have too much of a stake in not destroying our investments in each other. But it seems to me there is potential there, or I hope there is, and we better find out. In general, I mean, this is going way off in a sense, but it seems to me there's potential in thinking about a significant difference between the reemergence of great power transition in the 21st century and great power conflicts of the past, in that it is arguably less of interest to countries to maximize or increase their control of territory. Imperialism, real imperialism, is thoroughly delegitimized, and globalization and liberal economic ideology has convinced more people that they don't need autarky and so on. So the extent to which the causes of war that are precipitants rather than the sort of underlying structural permissive conditions is where I would focus a lot of attention. A lot of the criticism of neorealism, it seems to me, have been off base because they attribute more to the argument about the determining force of structure than it makes. Anarchy is the permissive condition, but Waltz was the first to say that if you want to look at why particular wars start, then you have to look to the unit level, to other things. And therefore, what are the substantive causes of conflict, aside from the structural ones that are manipulable? I'd encourage students to pay more attention to. We don't need many more dissertations that look at and manipulate ideas about structure, I think, but even as important as it is.
Most people have known, I think today, most people know very little about multipolarity. And if your guess about trends is wrong, if the world is not trending bipolar again, it is trending multipolar, I think we know next to nothing, especially about multipolar nuclear worlds. So I just disagree.
Well, they certainly should learn about it.
Yeah.
But I had a comment and then a question about your analysis. First, some in this room have written about how deterrence is easier than compellence. But you make a different argument, which is that it's more difficult politically to adopt a deterrent strategy now than potentially adopting a compellant strategy, which I think is a very interesting argument. It takes it another level. It takes it from how easy it is for your target to either accede to demands and puts it on the challenger and how difficult it is to actually adopt a specific strategy. So I like that. I look forward to reading your chapter. The question I had to do with your coding of the deterrence failures. And so I'd like to get back to this idea of Japan. Why Japan was not deterrable? Because it seems to me that there's two possible reasons that might apply to Iran now. The first would be that Japan, these other cases are cases of revisionist states that are expanding and deterring them does not impact their survival. So Germany is potentially deterrable because they don't necessarily need the labor's room. Same for the Soviet Union with Stalin and Korea. He doesn't care if the North go to the South, and the same type arguments for Iraq. But for Japan, it's either an argument about the nature of the state, or is it something that has to do with Japan post-economic depression and it felt need to expand into China for its own survival? So is it the nature of the Japanese, or is it the what's being demanded of them by deterrence that you believe caused them to be undeterrable?
I don't think they were undeterrable. I think deterrence failed. I'm not sure that a different strategy or different means of deterrence might not have had a different effect. As to whether they were undeterrable because of the militarist ideology and the devotion to autarky and other things, I don't know. But there's also a distinction between deterring the Japanese war against China, which really began in 1931, if not 37, and deterring the Japanese from attacking the United States. There, I think there probably are specific things that might have avoided the latter, although by mid-1941, we wanted more than to do the latter. We wanted to get them out of China. But the oil embargo or moving the fleet to Pearl Harbor, where it was arguably a magnet for attack rather than a deterrent, et cetera, are things that hypothetically might have made a difference. But that's separate from the question of what would have gotten them out of China if that was determined to be an American objective. And there, that would have been compellence by the time that American policy really tilted in that direction. Now, I do think deterrence probably is usually easier than compellence, and I know I haven't heard that often challenged by academics, although I guess my colleague David Baldwin did. But I think one reason, the main reason that compellence seems to be more attractive to people today, at least in regard to certain problems, I argued, was that it's not as hard as it would have been facing stronger opposition. We become more ambitious as we're able to do more with less. There may be other reasons, but that seems to me the main one.
So I have two questions left on my list. I'm going to get both of them, then you can respond, and then we can wrap this up and people can go on about the other way they celebrate the 70th anniversary of the war. So Josh and Galpin.
I'll pass in the interest of time.
So Galpin gets the last word.
I feel that in honor of deterrence, I should also defer. But
Deterrence is failing.
Yes,
That's fair.
not to
You're not
tack-
inferring nothing.
well, now that there are no longer any consequences if I screw up, it makes it easier for me to do.
That's what you think.
So, I mean, I thought this was fascinating, but what I kept thinking, especially as relates to my own research, is that everything you said about deterrence relates to nuclear weapons. And when I think about the world of the 21st century, I don't think about nuclear weapons all that much, right? I believe they might or might not be important. They might well be important. But more than anything else, what I think about are biologicals. And that many of the problems that you argue that deterrence enormously effective in terms of biological weapons, in terms of nuclear weapons, seems to me get a lot more difficult with biologicals. Just as an example, in the case when we were attacked by a biological weapon that appears to have been a product of our own laboratory, we were unable to get a forensic identification of that, with 10 years of effort, in any level that convinces anyone that I can tell that we were actually right in that identification. So, in thinking about a world of deterrence in the future, how do you feel that these sorts of technological changes, and in particular biologics, but if there are others that sort of spring to your attention, I'd love to hear about them, are going to influence this logic where, deterrence has been in decline for a long time, and maybe that'll
I've argued that logically, in the post-Cold War world, biological weapons should be of more concern to the United States because of the combination of lethality and availability. Now, luckily, it's very hard to deploy them efficiently and effectively. And they're also not easy to get. You can't whip them up in a bathtub with a few graduate students. But they are easier to get than nuclear weapons, and if efficiently deployed, have comparable killing power, especially if you're talking about the sort of first-generation low-yield fission weapons that most of the countries or groups we're worried about are all that they're likely to have for quite some time. But I don't think that idea has much traction. Most people just psychologically don't think of biological weapons as serious, as dangerous, or as something we need as much to do about as nuclear. And I'm not sure if that's simply for psychological reasons or because we're so accustomed to having thought of nuclear weapons as the apocalyptic threat, or because we have some experience with biological weapons, unlike nuclear warfare, and they don't look so bad compared to, in other words, there were people killed by biological weapons by the Japanese and China and so on. Amsha and Rikio tried and didn't get anywhere. Only, 6 people were killed by the anthrax letters. So I think maybe psychologically some people say, well, is that really all there is? But it seems to me, logically, they should get more attention. The best example, it seems to me, of that psychological difference and the refusal to accord as much significance to biological weapons was the decision to invade Iraq in 2003, because it was assumed Iraq had biological weapons. But while it was deemed important to invade Iraq so they couldn't build a weapon because they would use a nuclear weapon without provocation, there wasn't a comparable worry that they will use the WMD they have with provocation, with their backs against the wall. Well, we ran the experiment, and it turned out not to be an experiment, so phew. But it seemed to me that revealed a double standard that to me doesn't make logical sense, but seems to me to be pretty pervasive, even among people who think about these questions in Washington.
Well, before we let you go, somewhere down here, we have the Doolittle, the actual Doolittle Award.
Wow.
So if you're using the film or the camera, you can get the picture. We do this. We have to. Now it's time for you to. It's time for you to say this is.
Well, this is my shot.
Wow, that's neat.
That was mugshot.
So
Great.
they couldn't have gotten that off the aircraft carrier, I don't think. But congratulations and thank you for coming.
Appreciate it.
Join me in thanking Dick Fay.